Laura Tabili will be talking to the topic Finding Colonized Seafarers and Others in Unlikely Places, what to do when their quotation marks are no sources, close quotation marks. Laura Tabili is Professor of Modern European History at the University of Arizona. She has authored books and articles about migration to Britain from the colonies and from Europe, interracial and exogamous marriages, racially segmented labour markets, and masculinity, including, I quote, Global Migrants, Local Cultures, 1841 to 1939, Natives and Newcomers in Provincial England. And that was her publication of 2011. She's well known too for We Ask for British Justice, Workers and Racial Difference in Late Imperial Britain, published 1994. She's currently at work on a book about colonized seafarers and others in Interwar Britain, tentatively entitled To Get My Living, Colonized Migrants and Their Networks in Interwar Britain.
Okay, well, thank you very much. First, let me thank Valerie for convening this workshop and say what a pleasure it is to meet colleagues whose work I have long admired. I confess I haven't used the crew agreements nor the archives at Memorial, about whose riches we heard so much in February. And I also frantically wrote this paper. It's too long. I'm going to talk fast. Flag me down if I'm not clear. My remit, as I understand it, is to discuss the primary sources I have used as opposed to the crew agreements I haven't used in various projects and how one can coax information about colonized people, including seafarers, from sometimes neglected, recondite, or even hostile sources, which Naina, of course, oh, good grief, the phone. I'm sorry. I should have taken it off the hook. So anyway, or as the workshop announcement asks, how might researchers better explore primary sources to write post-colonial maritime histories? Well, to this I have to respond with 2 or 3 caveats, and one of those is that when I started my research in the 1980s, the term post-colonial was not in my vocabulary. Edward Said's Orientalism, of course, it appeared in 1979, but I hadn't read it, didn't read it for years. I did stumble across Henry Louis Gates's Race, Writing, and Difference at a Berkshire conference and found essays by Abdul John Hamid, John Muhammad, I'm sorry, Mary Louise Pratt, and Patrick Brantling are immensely helpful in corroborating what I had already found in the archives. But that too occurred after I had entered the archives with the methodological equipment of a conventional social historian trained to read against the grain of every document, or as Joan Scott put it, to read documents as texts. An American in Britain, I was struck by how racial categories differed in their definitions and objects between the US and Britain, and of course later I learned South Africa, the Caribbean, and so on. For instance, in my limited experience, South Asians in the United States were not considered Black, and yet in the British context, they sometimes were, right? I also came equipped with a training in gender analysis, which prompted me to ask heuristically if race, like gender, is unstable and fluid, which the archives were telling me it was, how would this help to explain what I was finding? So finally, I also have to admit I didn't come to this inquiry as a maritime historian, rather from an interest in colonized people, race, and racism, spurred especially by the summer riots of 1981, and that dates me, right? When I began research, the study of race was actually considered old news. I was told, oh, we settled that all in the 1970s. Plus, I was assured the project was impossible as there were no sources. Thus, the title of my piece, okay? And what I should really, I came up with the title rather hastily. What I should have actually said is Finding Colonized Seafarers and Others in Likely Places, because I've never been in an archive where there wasn't plenty of evidence of colonized people hiding in plain sight, right? So on to the sources. My first book, which some people may be familiar with, but it's rather old. So this was based on a close reading of policy documents in what was then called the Public Record Office and elsewhere, some of which had already been mined by other scholars. My research agenda was actually determined by chance and also by what someone in a previous workshop called curatorial choices. When the PRO shut down with Legionnaire's disease in spring 1984, just a few weeks into my first research trip, I was diverted to the India Office Library, then housed in an unprepossessing high-rise in Southwark. There, I found to my great good fortune that while the PRO had purged the relevant files heavily, the correspondence files in the India office remained apparently intact, much as they might have been when the ministry was hastily shut down after Indian independence. Unexpurgated, for the most part unread and even unfoliated, India office documents enabled a rich and minute reconstruction of the hounding of colonized seafarers and others in interwar Britain. And this is really where and actually, of course, then India office documents led me right back to the PRO when it reopened, not only to Home Office documents, but to Colonial Office documents and Board of Trade documents, which I don't think very many scholars had really considered at the time, at least. The maritime focus of the book really derived from the serendipitous preservation of records. And it also derived from the creation of the records themselves, which is, others have noted, the border control impetus, whether you're trying to keep people out or pornography, generates this very large body of source material. Now, I don't have very many, well, I'm not, don't have these documents to show you because as an impecunious graduate student in a pre-digital age, I did most of my, I gathered most of my documentation by copying it out in pencil in the archive, as everyone did in those days. But close reading against the grain yielded, a couple of things I think are worth talking about because, again, as Nana already said, these are documents generated by hostile administrators, public school boys, and people in the British bureaucracy who are not only contemptuous of colonized sailors, but they're contemptuous of working people generally, right? And they often damn them, when you do a close reading, you find they often damn themselves out of their own mouths. And one of my kind of favorite quotes from this was a moment of candor. Michael Brett of the Shipping Federation argued for segregated housing ashore. And the quote was, he said, the more they mix with the Europeans, the more ambitious they become to obtain European wages and European conditions. And what this revealing remark did was to completely contradict everything that employers had been saying about the reasons why they needed to segment and segregate their labor market, because they insisted that men of different nationalities would inevitably clash if they were mixed together. And then Michael Brett, of course, reveals that no, this is a divide and rule strategy instead. So for as many, as Naina has really helpfully shown us with her figures, a huge proportion of the British maritime labor force were colonized men, and of them, the overwhelming majority were, in fact, men on these Asiatic articles, or lascars, as they were called colloquially. What began to happen, and what happened, though, was that a very small, out of these tens of thousands, maybe a few thousand colonized men, jumped ship. They got off the ships in Britain, and in Britain they could get jobs that paid better. And so this piece of legislation called the Colourdalian Seaman Order was intended to control their movements. And I should really get my pictures up and start. Okay, PowerPoint. I would like to see my screen. Can't see it. I can't see my own screen. So anyway, I'm going to skip a little because Valerie tells me I'm already halfway through my time. So I'm going to skip to my next book. This is really exasperating. I cannot see my PowerPoint. So if Megan, if you could advance the PowerPoint, that would be immensely helpful because time is passing.
If you could unshare it, I'll share it on my computer.
Okay, where is it? Stop video. I'm sharing Microsoft PowerPoint. Now I want to stop sharing. Thank you, Megan. I'm so sorry. I don't just seem to work before we started, but it's not working now. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so let's look at slide number 2. This is from my second book. And it brings up, this is actually Census Enumerator's book showing Jamaican-born Samuel Price. And Samuel was, slide number 2 out of them. It's a CEB. We've all seen the Census Enumerator's book, and it's a little difficult to see. But Samuel Price from Jamaica is a member of this first household, and he's actually West Indies. Oh, why did I? Oh, Jamaica, West Indies. So the problem with the CEBs, and I'm not telling anyone they don't something they don't know. We don't know if Samuel Price was colonized or not. Did he feel colonized? Was he colonized? How is a person? What was his racial identity, his racial affiliation, his racial assignment, and what does that have to do with whether you're a colonized person or not? So that's one of the big difficulties. Let's have the second slide because I guess I'm running way behind time. Could we have the next slide, Megan? So the next slide is actually another thing that I used in my second book. And again, the people were saying, well, there are no people were. I was told there were just no records. You would never be able to do a project on colonized people or people of color in Britain because there were no records. So I'm just looking. What I want. My point is that just look for the people. There are colonized people in every record that has people, right? So first the census, second, this is the naturalization records. Naturalization. I looked at, for the second book, I went all the way into the middle of the 19th century, and I really didn't find any colonized people until the 1920s, and there are reasons for that, which I can't explain. But what this is, it's a duplicate certificate of nationality for a fellow called Qasim Ahmed, who was, in fact, a seafarer. And each of these duplicate records or naturalization certificates are very useful. They have the person's name, their current address, whether they're married or single, their birth date, and various other demographic data. And then on the back, they swear an oath. This man couldn't write English, and so he placed his mark. And of course, although he lived in South Shields, he swore his oath in Liverpool. So for each of these duplicate naturalization certificates, which are bound in bound volumes in the National Archives, as it's now called, there should be a corresponding H0144 record. If I could have the next slide, Megan. The problem is that for all of the colonized sailors that I was looking for in the town that I was examining, which was South Shields, every single one of them had been destroyed. Right up to 1935, they're almost intact. After 1935, they've been heavily purged. This is a big tragedy. I could go into the 2-year correspondence I had with the PRO over it and with Commission on the Public Records, David Cannadine, and so on. But the upshot is this is not the happy ending of the RGSS moving to Newfoundland. This is the sad ending of all of these records already having been destroyed. Now, I did get a look at one closed case file of a fellow called Ali Musa who lived in Sunderland, not South Shields. But as you can see, this case file is closed until 2032. So if people think they're going to live until 2032, I'd love to tell you what's in this record, but I'd have to kill you. Most of the salvaged files have been re-cataloged under the number H0405, which makes it very difficult to trace individuals from the duplicate certificates to the H0405s, and most of the closure dates on those are the 2040s and 2050s. So again, if you think you're going to live that long, I invite you to pursue this project. Could I have my next slide, Megan? I'm so sorry. Okay. A fallback, since the censuses, I was working on this about a decade ago, and of course the last census then was the 1901 census. Then I had a fallback on other, even less informative records, and I went to the electoral rolls, and luckily, of course, after the 1918 Representation of the People Act, your electoral rolls are a lot fuller. Before that, of course, it was only male householders. Afterwards, you get wives and dependents. And once again, on this slide, you can see down here at number 30, Laygate Place, you can see Hamad and Jenny Sheriff. They transliterated their name to a name that was actually very common among British people in that town. And this NM indicates that Hamad was either military or naval, and of course, most likely a sailor. So next slide, please, Megan. So then the certificates of nationality. In order for a man to get himself off of having to register as a colored alien, and there's a whole subplot in that first book about who's defined as colored, because obviously that's racism is all too real. Race itself, as we know, is a fiction. So in order to get for a man to get himself off this colored alien register, he could do two things. He could apply for a passport, and about half of men did. About 2,000 men got passports by hook or crook because the British government didn't really want them to get that. And some of them applied for this thing called the Special Certificate of Nationality and Identity. This is the application form for it, and this is the mugshot of the young man who is applying for it. There are about 300 of these special certificate case files surviving. Very few of them actually have this application in them, partly because I don't think his application was successful, but all 300 of them have very, very rich documentation. And I should say that if you get a hold of the naturalization case file in 2040, it will have very rich documentation in it. And so these really are enabling me with my current project to not just to reconstruct where individual men went, which men had to account for everything they'd done, but in addition, it's enabling me to figure out the configuration of communities in places like Cardiff, Liverpool, Hull, and so on. So I've got a little bit more to do. Could I have the next slide, Megan? So all that this shows is that the initial registration, lower right-hand corner, about a little over 5,000 men were registered as colored alien seamen. And what this shows is by 1939, more than half of them had got themselves some kind of credential that enabled them to not be registered as a colored alien seaman. 2,000 passports and about 1,800 certificates of nationality, about 300 of which survived. So most of them were apparently destroyed. Could I have the next slide, Megan? So this is what one of those certificates actually looked like, and this is a young man called Farah Muhammad alias Yusuf Ali Douala. A lot of these guys had aliases, and I think that Ravi and Naina can tell us about that. So this is what one of those of the past actually looked like. Now, could I have the next slide? Since I'm trying to keep to my time. So this is, I managed to find someone. I was actually in Sheffield, and I was looking for people from Sheffield to kind of duplicate the South Shields project in a rudimentary way. And this is a fellow, this is the smoking gun. And I think that Ravi has written something, and I, of course, have the quote in my notes, which I'm not going to be able to find now, but he said, well, these are really very small communities in the 20s and 30s, but they became the foundation for the mass migration of the 50s and 60s. And what this Ali Qasim's passport, he applied for the passport in 1961 so he could go home and live in Yemen. He was born in Steamer Point, Yemen, but he came to Britain in 1921 and he was a sailor, and there was documentation that he had in fact been a sailor as recently as the mid 1950s, sailing out of Hull, and then he moved to Sheffield and became a steel worker. So this is your smoking gun of an individual who started out as a sailor and then went to an inland town to become a worker in industry. So I was really happy to find this because we do have some scholars out there who are saying there's no relationship between the post-45 mass migration and the interwar 1920s. And I just had two more slides. I'm not going to say, just to show you. This is one of my guys. He's got a really interesting story, which I don't have time to tell. But one of the things I thought was striking was that instead of sending a mugshot for his application, he sent this rather elegant studio portrait. And I think as we're talking about resistance, agency, and of course trying to read agency through these records that are generated by the non-subalterns, that this is a little bit of an act of resistance, of just saying, you know, I'm not just the person in the mugshot. I'm a whole person and I have a whole life that you don't know about. Could I have the next slide, please? And then I'm done. Another person, Richard Woodfield, had lived in Britain. He came from the West Indies. He lived in Britain since before the First World War, served in the war, eligible for war medals, made to apply for this colored alien seaman credential in the 1920s. By then he was living in Liverpool, not in Toxteth, but in another part of Liverpool. He was married. I don't also, out of these 300 cases, I don't have very many pictures, but these are two that are I thought were particularly striking because they show something about an individual that you don't normally get from a mugshot. So to sum up, all of these records were hiding in plain sight. Where do you look to find colonized seafarers? You look in the same places that you look for other people. And I was, you know, when I was told there were no records, it's because of the dogged belief that there actually weren't any colonized people in Britain until after the Windrush. And I think all you have to do is look and you'll find them. Thank you for your patience.